On a Saturday morning in April of 1989 in Boone County, Iowa, a 64-year-old farmer named Wendell Prater stood at a weathered fence post on the shoulder of Highway 17 and looked across 4 acres of dying apple trees that no one else in 3 counties was willing to take for free. The wind came flat off the open corn ground, with nothing to stop it, cold and steady, the kind of spring wind that finds every gap in a canvas coat. Wendell did not move for a long time. He rested both hands on the rail of that fence, and he studied the land the way a man studies a piece of worn machinery he is thinking about rebuilding, not admiring but calculating. He looked at the slope. He looked at where water would run after a hard rain. He looked at the pale, dense ground beneath his boots and at the gray splitting bark of 64 apple trees standing in rows that had not been properly tended since the middle of the Reagan administration. A handwritten sign had been nailed to the fence post for 13 straight days. $300, orchard for sale. Most people who drove Highway 17 that April slowed down enough to read the first 4 words, decided Harlan Doss had finally lost his mind, and kept driving. Let me tell you about that orchard, because you need to understand the land before you can understand what Wendell Prater saw when he stood at that fence. The property had belonged to Harlan Doss, and before him to his father, Merrick Doss, and before him to Merrick's father, Elias Doss, who had set the first signs on that hillside in 1912 with a grafting knife he bought at a hardware store in Jefferson for 75 cents. 3 generations of Doss men had grown apples on that 4-acre piece of Boone County, and 3 generations had slowly pushed the ground past what it was willing to give. The irrigation lines laid shallow and crooked in 1971 and never truly maintained after ran cracked through half their length from 2 decades of Iowa winters. The topsoil had been worked hard with synthetic nitrogen through the middle and late 70s, the way everybody was working soil back then, and by the spring of 1989, it sat pale and airless under the crown of every tree, barely able to hold moisture for 2 days after a rain. The trees themselves stood with bark splitting along the main trunks and canopies thin and brittle against the sky. In 1988, they had produced fruit so small and bitter that Harlan could not give it away at the Ogden Methodist rummage sale. He was asking $300 for all of it: the land, the trees, the broken lines, the shed at the back, and 2 rusted hand tools leaning against the shed wall. $300, and after 13 days nailed to a fence post, he still had not found a single buyer. Lowell Beecham from the Boone County Extension Office had driven out to the Doss property on a Wednesday in the first week of April. Lowell was 58 years old, a career extension agent with a bachelor's degree in agronomy from Iowa State, and 29 years of service to the county, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had watched enough farmers fail that he had stopped being surprised by it. He walked the 4 acres in his clean boots. He took soil samples in labeled paper bags. He examined the root flare of 6 different trees. And then he sat down across from Harlan Doss at Harlan's kitchen table and delivered his assessment in the kind of plain, careful language a man uses when he believes the thing he is saying cannot reasonably be argued with. Harlan Lowell said, "I'm going to be straight with you because you've earned that. This ground is non-viable. The topsoil is depleted past the point of a reasonable recovery window. The root systems on those trees are too far gone to graft back onto without the kind of commercial investment that would cost you more than the land itself is worth. My recommendation is that you file for an agricultural loss designation with the county, reduce your tax burden, and let somebody bulldoze it for pasture in 3 years." Harlan nodded. Lowell shook his hand. Lowell drove back to the extension office in Ogden, put his assessment in writing on a single sheet of county letterhead, filed it under Doss Property Highway 17. Non-viable slid the folder into the tall gray cabinet in the back room and did not think about that orchard again for the rest of April. Royce Keltner heard the news over the telephone on a Thursday evening. Royce was 56 years old, and he had run the John Deere dealership on the eastern edge of Boone for 23 years, and in all 23 of those years, he had never once sold a tractor to Wendell Prater. He had tried. 7 times since 1978, he had driven the 8 miles out to the Prater farm with a fresh brochure and a freshly rehearsed financing pitch. And 7 times he had driven home with the brochure unopened on the seat beside him and a sour feeling in his chest that he could not quite put a name to. When the phone rang that Thursday night and Dwight Mosher said on the other end that Wendell Prater had apparently been seen walking the fence at Harlan Doss's place that afternoon, Royce laughed before he could stop himself. Dwight, he said, the old man's last act on this earth is going to be trying to farm a graveyard with hand tools and a Minneapolis Moline that's older than my marriage. That's his retirement plan right there. That's Wendell Prater's idea of a good investment. You tell me there's any man in Boone County more stubborn than that, and I'll buy his lunch. Dwight laughed on the other end. They talked for another 6 minutes about the price of nitrogen and about whether it was going to freeze one more time before planting, and then they hung up, and neither of them thought about Wendell Prater again that week. Wendell drove out to Highway 17 the following Saturday morning, the 15th of April. He pulled his 1969 Chevrolet C10 onto the gravel shoulder set. The parking brake climbed out slowly because his right knee had been complaining since early March, and walked the 40 feet to the fence. He did not walk the property, not yet. He stood at the fence for 22 minutes. He looked at the angle of the slope where it came down toward the county road. He looked at the low corner where standing water would sit after a storm. He looked at which trees were in the worst shape along the bottom of the property and which trees along the upper fence line had at least kept some of their bark intact. He crouched down near the post, grunted once when the knee caught, picked up a handful of dirt, and held it in his open palm, feeling the texture of it, smelling it, letting it sift slowly back through his fingers to the ground. Then he walked back to the Chevy, opened the passenger door, and lifted out a clean quart mason jar he had rinsed in the kitchen sink that morning. He carried the jar back to the fence and put it in the deep pocket of his canvas coat. Harlan Doss came out of his farmhouse when he saw the truck. They shook hands over the top rail. Harlan, 61 years old and looking 10 years older than that, explained unnecessarily that the place was in rough shape. Wendell nodded. Harlan said the irrigation was broken. Wendell nodded again. Harlan said that Lowell Beecham had written the ground off as non-viable. Wendell looked at the trees for a long moment after that. Then he looked at Harlan. "I'll give you $300 for it," Wendell said. Harlan blinked. He asked quietly if Wendell understood what he was looking at. Wendell said that he did. Harlan took the $300 in cash that afternoon, folded the bills once and pushed them down into the breast pocket of his work shirt. Before he drove away, Wendell filled the mason jar from 4 different spots along the property: the high end near the fence, the middle of the second row, the low corner, the flat by the shed. He set the jar carefully on the passenger seat of the Chevy, where it rattled gently against the cracked vinyl all the way home. He drove the 12 miles east of Ogden at 45 miles an hour, both hands on the wheel, and he pulled into the Prater farmyard just after 4 in the afternoon. Ruth was sitting on the front porch in her blue cardigan, shelling peas into a yellow ceramic bowl she had owned since their wedding in 1969. Wendell climbed the 3 wooden steps. He set the mason jar on the porch railing between them. He did not sit down. Ruth looked at the jar. She looked at her husband. The pea pods went still in her hands. "You bought it, didn't you?" she said. Wendell nodded once. Ruth looked at the jar again for a long moment. The pale, dense soil pressed against the glass in the flat evening light. "Clement would have smiled," she said quietly. Wendell said he would have started tomorrow. Ruth set the bowl of peas on the porch floor beside her chair, and she stood up. She put her hand flat against Wendell's chest for just 1 second, the way she had done on their wedding day, and on the day Clement died in 1978, and on the day in 1983 when the bank had come within $350 of taking the East 40 from them. Then she picked up the bowl and she went inside to start supper. Wendell stood alone on the porch. He looked at the mason jar on the railing. And what none of the men who would laugh at him over the next 11 years understood, not Lowell Beecham with his non-viable stamp, not Royce Keltner with his 7th unsold brochure, not Dwight Mosher laughing into a telephone on a Thursday night, was that Wendell Prater had been waiting 27 years to buy that orchard. And the only person who had ever understood why had been buried in the Clover Ridge Cemetery since February of 1973. Let me tell you about Wendell Prater, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did with $300. He was born in the front bedroom of the farmhouse where he still lived on the 11th of October, 1924, on 120 acres of corn and soybean ground 4 miles east of Ogden. The farm had been in the Prater name since 1911 when his grandfather, Elias Prater, stepped off a westbound train at the Des Moines Depot with $140 in his pocket and a letter from a land agent that turned out to be partially true and mostly lies. Elias bought the first 40 acres for $9 an acre paid in cash and broke the first sod with a single bottom walking plow behind a team of mares he named Agnes and Tilly. His son Clement bought the second 40 in 1936 during the worst year of the Great Depression from a widow who was losing the place to the bank and who sold it to Clement because she said she would rather see a Prater on it than a stranger. Clement bought the third 40 in 1947 after he came home from running motor pool in North Africa, and he farmed all 120 acres with a Minneapolis Moline UTU tractor he bought used off an auction lot names in 1952, a 2-bottom plow, a set of hand tools he had inherited from his own father, and a philosophy he stated the same way every single time a banker came out to the farm. "I don't owe any man anything," Clement would say, "and I intend to stay that way." The bankers would smile and they would drive off and they would shake their heads and Clement would go back to work. He died in the spring of 1978 of a stroke in the tool room at the back of the barn at 74 years old with his hands still on the handle of a pitchfork and 17 cents in his front pocket. He owed nobody when he died. He had told Wendell once when Wendell was 12 years old and learning to sharpen a grafting knife on the whetstone that still sat on the workbench. "A dull blade here. Woodson, a sharp blade, ask wood the truth." Wendell had never forgotten that sentence. He had sharpened every blade he ever owned at 12 degrees on that same whetstone for 50 years. Wendell took over the farm in 1971 when Clement's left hip finally gave out and the Minneapolis Moline had to be started by a younger man in the cold mornings. Wendell was 47 years old that year. He had been farming alongside his father full-time since 1953, the year he came home from a construction job in Omaha, and told Clement he was done with it. He married Ruth Hensley in 1969 after what his mother called a ridiculously long courtship and what Ruth called an entirely appropriate amount of caution, and they had set up housekeeping in the small frame house at the west end of the Prater land, where Clement and his wife had started out in 1929. Ruth was 62 now. She had taught 4th grade at Ogden Elementary School for 31 years before she retired in 1987. She was the kind of woman who did not raise her voice, did not waste her steps, and did not tolerate foolishness in children or in husbands, which was a large part of why Wendell had loved her since the first time he saw her at a Grange supper in the spring of 1967. They had no children. They had tried for 4 years in the early 70s and it had not worked, and eventually they had stopped trying and stopped talking about it, and Ruth had poured the care she would have given her own into 31 classes of other people's children, and Wendell had poured his into the 120 acres his grandfather had walked onto in 1911. They had made a life out of what they had, and they had made it well, and the neighbors who had pitied them early on had mostly come around to the understanding that the Prater house was one of the quieter and steadier houses in the township, and that Ruth Prater was one of the few people in Boone County whose opinion a man ought to listen to if he was lucky enough to be asked for it. Let me tell you about Edna Frasier, because she is the reason Wendell Prater was standing at that fence on Highway 17 with a mason jar in his coat pocket. She was born in 1892 on a 40-acre farm in Webster County, Iowa, to parents who had come over from Denmark with nothing but the accent they never quite lost. She married a man named Albert Frasier in 1918, and they bought 40 acres of their own along the low ridge outside of Clover Ridge, Iowa, in the spring of 1923. Albert Frasier died in July of 1945, 6 weeks to the day after the news came that the war in Europe was over. He had not gone to the war. He had died of a stroke while stretching new wire along a fence line on the back of his own property. Edna was 53 years old, and she had no children, and she had 40 acres that her husband had been running, and she had the choice that every farm widow in 1945 had to make: sell the place and move into town and live small, or keep the farm and then work it herself with whatever help she could afford, which in Edna Frasier's case turned out to be almost none at all. She kept the farm. She farmed it alone for 25 years. She farmed it through the post-war chemical agriculture revolution that she refused to join, through the soil depletion crisis of the late 1950s, through the farm consolidation wave of the 1960s, and into 1971, when her back finally told her it had given all it had to give. She sold the place to a younger family at a fair price. She moved into a small house on the north edge of Clover Ridge. She died of pneumonia in February of 1973 at 81 years old. 4 people came to her funeral on a morning so cold the gravediggers had to use a kerosene heater to thaw the ground. Wendell Prater was one of those 4 people. He drove home that afternoon and sat in his truck in the farmyard for almost an hour before he went inside. Wendell had first met Edna Frasier in the spring of 1962. He was 37 years old. He had driven out to Clover Ridge on a Tuesday morning because Clement had sent him, and Clement had sent him because Clement had known Edna's father back in the 30s, and because Clement had said, and these were his exact words, "That woman has forgotten more about soil than the whole county extension office will ever learn." Wendell had pulled into Edna's farmyard on a morning in late April. She came out of the barn in an old canvas coat that had been patched 3 times at the elbows, and she looked him up and down once with the same quiet measuring look his mother used to give him, and she said, "Clement's boy," and he said, "Yes, ma'am." She held out her hand, palm up, with a mason jar of dark Iowa soil in it, and she said, "Hold this." Wendell took the jar. She said, "Close your eyes." He closed them. She said, "Now, tell me what that soil needs." He stood there for what felt like a very long minute, feeling faintly ridiculous holding a jar of dirt with his eyes closed in the barnyard of a widow he had just met. And he eventually said, "I don't know." Edna Frasier said, "Good, that's the right answer for a man who has never done this before." Then she brought him inside and she made coffee, and she spent 3 hours at her kitchen table explaining to him, in the patient, careful voice of a woman who had taught this lesson perhaps 100 times over the years, and never once charged a penny for it, that the soil would tell you what it needed if you were quiet enough to listen to it. "Most farmers talk too much," she said, "and touch the ground too little, and the ones who went broke the fastest were always the ones who treated the soil like a machine." "Put inputs in, Wendell," she said. "Get outputs out. Never ask how the machine is feeling." She tapped her finger on the kitchen table once for emphasis. "A farm isn't a machine," she said. "A farm is a conversation." Wendell listened that day. He listened every Tuesday morning for the next 9 years. Edna taught him about cover crops, about crimson clover for nitrogen, about winter rye for root depth, about hairy vetch for both, about buckwheat for pollinators and weed suppression, about comfrey planted along fence lines to mine the deep subsoil with its long tap roots, about earthworms as the honest measure of a living soil, the number you could actually count with your own 2 hands on a spring morning if you turned a spade of dirt in the right row. She taught him about grafting, about how a tree that looked dead from the road might still have living cambium under the bark if you knew where to cut and how to look and how to wait. She taught him about an apple variety her father had planted on the Webster County farm in 1911, a dense-fleshed, sharp-tasting, long-keeping apple that ripened in stages from mid-September through late October and stored without refrigeration clear into January. She called it, without any embarrassment at all, the Frasier. In the fall of 1965, she handed Wendell a cardboard box containing 28 lengths of scion wood from her oldest Frasier tree, wrapped in damp newspaper and tied with kitchen twine. Clement Prater planted that scion wood on the south slope of the Prater farm In the spring of 1966, grafted onto seedling rootstock he had started himself in a tin tub by the back porch. 21 of those grafts took. 6 of them survived the next 5 years. One of them, one single tree, survived everything Iowa threw at it and kept producing. Clement named that variety the Prater Keeper because Edna had told him once that a man ought to be allowed to name a thing after the family that kept it alive. That one tree was 23 years old in the spring of 1989. It still stood on the south slope. It produced 6 bushels of fruit every other fall without fail. It was the tree Wendell had been thinking about when he stood at the fence on Highway 17. It was the tree whose scion would go into the dying orchard if the dying orchard was willing to accept it. Edna Frasier had been dead for 16 years. Wendell had not spoken her name aloud since the afternoon of her funeral. He had kept her Tuesday lessons the way some men keep a pocket watch that belonged to their father. In a drawer, wrapped in soft cloth, taken out only in private, never explained to anyone who had not earned the right to ask. Royce Keltner drove his blue Chevrolet pickup up the Prater farm lane on the Tuesday after Wendell bought the orchard. A brand new John Deere 464 brochure rode on the passenger seat beside him. Wendell was in the equipment shed with the hood of the Minneapolis Moline up, draining the old oil into a wide aluminum tray, and he wiped his hands on a red rag and walked out to meet Royce at the fence. Royce did not come around the side of the pickup. He leaned on the open driver door the way a man leans when he plans to be somewhere else in under 15 minutes. Wendell, he said, I'll be honest with you. You and I both know that Minneapolis Moline is 37 years old. You're 64. Your knees can't take another decade crawling around under that thing. I've got a John Deere 4640 sitting on the lot right now. Demo unit 1,100 hours, immaculate inside and out. 62,400 out the door. Financing at 9.25 over 20 years. That's reasonable money for the next 20 years of your life. Now I've been at this 23 years, Wendell, and I'm telling you as a favor, it's time. Wendell listened to every sentence. He wiped his hands on the rag a second time slower. Then he said, Royce, I haven't owed any man anything since 1971, and I don't intend to start this week. Royce's mouth tightened around the edges. He said, Wendell, that's not a virtue. That's a ceiling. Wendell did not answer. He turned and he walked back into the shed. Royce stood at the pickup for another 20 seconds. Then he dropped the brochure on the top of the fence post, got into the cab, and backed down the lane. When the dust had settled, Wendell came out, picked up the brochure without opening it, carried it across the yard to the rusted burn barrel by the smokehouse and dropped it in. He went back to the oil pan. At the Farmers Cooperative on the east edge of Ogden that same Saturday morning, Dwight Mosher was holding court at the front counter with a styrofoam cup of coffee in his hand and 7 men standing around him. Dwight was 42 years old. He had taken over his father's 160-acre apple operation south of Ogden in 1979, and he had spent the decade since expanding it as aggressively as any orchardist in central Iowa, with new dwarf rootstock plantings on semi-dwarf interstems, 16 miles of drip irrigation line, and a commercial controlled atmosphere. Cold storage facility he had financed in the spring of 1988 for $385,000 at 8.75% over 15 years. He knew orchards. He knew exactly what a depleted 4-acre orchard looked like, and he knew exactly what it cost to fix one back to production. Hobart Tinsley, the cooperative manager, a quiet, round-faced man of 59 who had known every farmer in the county for decades and who did not often take sides, had just mentioned to the group that Wendell Prater had handed Harlan Doss $300 in cash the Saturday before for the orchard on Highway 17. Dwight laughed out loud before anyone else had time to react. Wendell Prater paid $300 for firewood, he said. That is exactly what he bought, firewood. That Minneapolis Moline has finally rusted clear into the man's skull. I'm telling you right now, the old man's last act on this earth is going to be wandering around a graveyard of apple trees with a canvas seed bag on his shoulder, scattering clover by hand like Moses in the Iowa wilderness. Dwight took a long swallow of his coffee and shook his head in slow pity. Now nobody at that counter thought what Dwight was saying was especially cruel. They were practical men in a practical town, and practically speaking, what Wendell Prater had just done with $300 did not make any sense at all. And when something does not make any sense, even decent men will sometimes laugh at it. Hobart Tinsley laughed quietly into his own coffee cup. He rang up Dwight's order a 50-pound bag of calcium nitrate and 2 cases of copper sulfate spray, and Dwight loaded them into the bed of his new 3/4 ton and drove south toward his own orchard without giving Wendell Prater another thought that week. Let me tell you what was happening in American agriculture in the spring of 1989, because you cannot properly understand what Wendell Prater was about to spend the next 11 years doing unless you understand what country he was doing it in. The farm crisis of the early 1980s had just finished tearing the rural Midwest almost in half. Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, had pushed the prime interest rate to 21.5% in June of 1981 in a deliberate effort to break the back of American inflation in American farmland, which an entire generation of rural bankers had been treating as reliable collateral against aggressive expansion loans, had crashed in value by 63% in Iowa between 1981 and 1986, from a peak of $2,147 an acre down to $787 an acre. Between 1980 and 1987, over 300,000 American family farms had been lost to foreclosure, consolidation, or forced sale. The state of Iowa alone had lost more than 20,000 of them. The Federal Land Bank of Omaha had failed. The farm credit system had absorbed losses of $2.7 billion in a single fiscal year. The suicide rate among American farmers had climbed during the worst stretch of the crisis to roughly 3 times the national average. By the spring of 1989, the farmers still standing in central Iowa were either too big to fail or too small to be worth the cost of foreclosing on. Wendell Prater was solidly the second kind. Dwight Mosher was trying very hard with $385,000 of controlled atmosphere storage debt on his books to become the first kind. Neither of them knew yet that the next 11 years would settle between them without any need for an argument which one had read the ground correctly. Wendell spent the first 3 weeks of May just studying the orchard. He drove out to Highway 17 every morning before the heat came in, parked the Chevy on the gravel shoulder, walked through the fence gap, and moved slowly down the rows, kneeling every 30 feet to press his fingers into the soil and feel for himself what the ground had left in it. On the 3rd morning, he brought the mason jar, the same one he had filled on the day of the purchase, clean now and dry, and he refilled it from 4 new spots across the property. He carried the jar home and set it on the kitchen windowsill above the sink where the morning light would catch it, and for 2 consecutive evenings after supper, he sat at the kitchen table and looked at it in different lights. He rubbed samples from the jar between his thumb and forefinger, feeling the grain of it. He lifted the jar to his nose and breathed in the faint, dry smell of it. He did not speak while he did this. Ruth did not ask him to. She had watched Clement do exactly the same thing at exactly that table 30 years earlier, and she had heard the name Edna Frasier spoken in that kitchen more than once, and she understood better than most women in Iowa that there were forms of work which did not look like work to the people driving past on Highway 17. On the evening of the second day, Wendell set the jar down on the kitchen table between them, looked at his wife across the cleared supper dishes, and said one sentence. "It's not dead, Ruth," he said. "It's starved." Ruth looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "I know." And she passed him the butter dish. Let me tell you about cover crops, because the next 5 years of Wendell Prater's life turned on the contents of one canvas seed bag. A cover crop is a plant you put in the ground between the rows of whatever you are actually trying to grow. Not for harvest, not for income, but to return something to the soil that the previous crop has taken out of it. Crimson clover is a legume, and like every legume in God's creation, it hosts bacteria in the nodules of its root system that pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere and fix it into the ground in a form that the next crop can actually use. Winter rye has a deep, aggressive root system that loosens compacted subsoil and adds enormous amounts of organic biomass when you turn it under in the spring. Hairy vetch does both jobs at once, nitrogen and biomass. Buckwheat grows fast enough to outcompete most weeds and blooms quickly enough to feed pollinators when you let it flower. The modern commercial approach to a depleted orchard, the approach Lowell Beecham would have recommended to any farmer foolish enough to walk into his office and ask, was to apply a full program of synthetic nitrogen, synthetic phosphorus, synthetic potassium, and commercial agricultural lime at a cost of approximately $1,200 per acre for the first year alone, with at least 3 additional years of continuous application before a man could reasonably expect to see any structural change in the topsoil layer. That was $4,800 for 4 acres, not counting labor, not counting fuel, and not counting the compounding soil damage that came with it. Wendell Prater walked into the Boone County seed store on a Wednesday morning in early May of 1989 and bought 22 pounds of crimson clover seed, 30 pounds of winter rye, 6 pounds of hairy vetch, and 4 pounds of buckwheat. The clerk added it up on a paper pad, $47.18. Wendell paid in cash out of a worn leather wallet. He loaded the canvas bags into the bed of the Chevy, drove out to Highway 17, and allowed himself, for the first time since he had stood at that fence on the 15th of April, a very small private smile. The mockery widened through May. It moved the way news always moved in a town the size of Ogden, gently and inaccurately and constantly. Hobart Tinsley at the cooperative began reporting to anyone who asked that Wendell was hand-seeding those 4 acres without a broadcast spreader, without a tractor, mounted seeder, without any equipment at all, just a canvas bag over one shoulder and a man walking each row slowly at dawn. The story traveled from the co-op counter to the back booth at the Ogden Diner by Tuesday afternoon. It reached the Fellowship Hall of Ogden Methodist Church by the following Sunday morning. Pastor Vernon Sills, a kindly bald man of 63 who had buried Clement Prater in 1978, and who thought of Wendell as one of the steadier pillars in his congregation, mentioned from the pulpit on the second Sunday in May, without naming anyone, that the people of the congregation should keep in their prayers those among them whose judgment seemed to be slipping in their later years. 3 women in the pews turned their heads just slightly toward Ruth Prater. Ruth kept her eyes on the hymnal, and she sang the next hymn half a step louder than she ordinarily would have. Dwight Mosher at the co-op on the last Saturday of May said the same line again to a fresh audience of 4 farmers who had not yet heard any of it. Hand seeding, by hand, in 1989, like Moses in the Iowa wilderness. The laughter at the counter that morning was louder than the first time. Hobart Tinsley laughed quietly along with them. He rang up 3 bags of ammonium sulfate. He did not say anything in Wendell's defense. There was nothing to say. Wendell was not there to be defended. Wendell was on a hillside 13 miles away with a canvas bag over his right shoulder walking the rows at dawn. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever known all the way down in the bones of you that you were right about something while every man you respected told you that you were wrong? Have you ever had to keep working anyway, knowing you would not be able to prove it for years? Have you ever carried in your memory the voice of a father and the voice of a teacher who had both told you the same quiet, careful truth, and known that the quiet truth would outlast the loud opinions, but known at the same time that it was going to cost you something real to wait for it? That was Wendell Prater in May of 1989. He was not stubborn. He was not deluded. He was patient in a way the rest of Boone County had forgotten how to be. He seeded the 4 acres over 4 straight mornings in the 3rd week of May. He walked each row with the canvas bag riding on his right shoulder, the leather strap worn soft where it had sat against his coat for years, and he scattered seed with the steady rhythm of a man who had nowhere to be and no reason at all to hurry. He did not think about Dwight Mosher while he walked. He did not think about Royce Keltner. He did not think about Lowell Beecham. He thought about the way the clover seed left his fingers and about the slow angle of the slope beneath his boots and about the way the cold early light came across the top row at 6:15 in the morning when he could still see his breath against the air. On the third morning, halfway down the second row, a memory arrived the way certain memories sometimes do, uninvited and whole. He was 9 years old again. It was the spring of 1934. He was walking 2 steps behind his father across the north cornfield of the home place, and Clement Prater was scattering rye seed from a burlap bag the same way Wendell was scattering clover now. Clement stopped at the end of the row and turned and looked down at his small son, and he said, "You don't seed soil, Wendell. You introduce yourself to it." Wendell had not understood that sentence at 9 years old. He had not understood it at 30. He understood it standing on Highway 17 in May of 1989. He stopped at the end of the second row. He took his cap off for just a moment and held it in his hand. He put the cap back on his head. He kept walking. People drove past on Highway 17 that third week of May, and they saw an old man in a worn canvas coat scattering seed by hand across a dead orchard. And they told the story at the co-op and at the diner and at the church coffee hour. And by the last Saturday of the month, there was not a farmer, shopkeeper, extension, agent, feed salesman, or elevator clerk in Boone County who had not heard one version or another of it. The laughter was not mean. The laughter was practical, which is sometimes a harder thing than meanness to answer. Wendell heard enough of it through the normal channels of a small Iowa town to know exactly what was being said about him at every counter in the county. He made no response. He did not explain himself at the feed store. He did not defend his purchase at the co-op. He nodded when he was spoken to, paid cash for what he needed, and drove back out to Highway 17 before the sun was high. Ruth drove the Chevy down to the orchard at noon on the last day of the seeding with a thermos of black coffee and 2 thick ham sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. She parked on the gravel shoulder and walked up to the fence. Wendell came down from the top row and sat beside her on the dropped tailgate of the pickup. They ate in silence for a while, the way long married people eat, with almost no words and with a kind of quiet ease that younger couples have not yet learned is worth anything. After a while, Ruth said, "They're laughing in Ogden." Wendell said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment, folding the wax paper in her lap in careful, precise squares. "They laughed at Clement in 1954, she said, when he refused to go into the new herbicide program. He buried 2 of them. Wendell said, "I'm not racing anyone, Ruth." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. "You don't have to," she said. "Just outlast them." She handed him the last half of her sandwich. She walked back to the Chevy. She drove home. Wendell seated the last canvas bag on the 24th of May, 1989. He walked back up to the shed at the top of the property, hung the empty bag on a nail behind the door, and stood for a long moment looking out over 4 acres that to any passing eye still looked exactly like a graveyard of apple trees. He drove home. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink. He ate supper with Ruth. He went to bed early. He did not know yet that the work he had just begun would not produce a single sellable apple for 5 full years. He did not know yet that the Iowa drought of 1991 was coming and would force him to choose between saving water for the orchard and saving water for the corn that paid his bills. He did not know yet that his wife would nearly die on the kitchen floor of their own home on a July morning in 1993 while he was 13 miles away, walking those same orchard rows with dirt on his hands and his mind fixed on a graft he was planning for the fall. He did not know that a 15-year-old boy named Caleb Rennick, who was that very May working the night shift at the Casey's General Store on the east edge of Ogden for $3.85 an hour, would one day drive a mason jar of pale, dense soil from a dying orchard in Story County to Wendell's own kitchen table and set it down between them the same way Edna Frasier had set a jar down in front of Wendell in her kitchen in the spring of 1962. He knew none of it yet. He knew only what he knew that night, which was that the seed was finally in the ground, and the ground was not dead, but only starved, and the clock he had been waiting 27 years to start had finally started running. He slept that night the way a man sleeps when he has done exactly what he came to do, And he has 11 years of patience to spend doing the rest of it, and he has no intention whatsoever of hurrying for anyone in Boone County, Iowa, or anywhere else in the United States of America. Let me tell you about the first year, because the first year is when most men quit. The clover and rye came up the way cover crops always come up in Iowa, not all at once, not dramatically, but in the slow, patient way that seed does when it has been put in the ground correctly and then left alone. By the second week of June 1989, Wendell Prater could see a faint green haze between the rows of dying apple trees if he stood at the fence and looked at the property from the right angle. By the first week of July, the haze had become a soft, thick carpet. By the middle of August, the crimson clover was blooming, and the top of the hillside held a band of deep red flowers that drivers on Highway 17 could see from a quarter-mile away. Nobody driving past understood what they were looking at. They saw an old man's dead orchard that was now also full of flowers, and they shook their heads at the strangeness of it, and they kept driving. Wendell was not watching the flowers. He was watching the ground. He walked the rows every morning, and he pressed his fingers into the soil at the same 4 stations he had sampled in April, and he noted in the spiral notebook he had bought for 15 cents at the Boone Pharmacy that the ground in the upper section was beginning faintly to change its texture. In the middle of June, while the cover crop was still establishing, Wendell started on the irrigation. The system Harlan Doss had been running when he had been running anything at all was a shallow gravity feed line from a catchment tank at the top of the property, fed by a spring that still ran clean and cold out of the ridge above the orchard. The tank itself was sound. The problem was every piece of aluminum line between the tank and the trees. Wendell pulled every length of it out of the ground with his own 2 hands over the course of 3 weeks, working in the mornings before the heat came in. He relayed the entire system along new grades he calculated by eye-walking the slope with a carpenter's level and a roll of string marking each stake with a piece of orange flagging tape. He bought replacement aluminum pipe in 10-foot lengths from Donaldson Hardware in Boone, 14 lengths at $15.30 apiece. He bought a propane torch and 4 pounds of solder and a canister of flux. He bought replacement gate valves for the 4-zone heads. The hardware receipt for the full summer came to $214, for pipe $16, for solder and flux $47, for valves and fittings, and $9 for the flagging tape and stakes. $286 and change. Wendell soldered every joint himself in the shed at the back of the property, the same shed Harlan Doss had not unlocked in 4 years. He did not rush any of it. Every joint got clean, fluxed, seeded, and heated the way his father had taught him to do metalwork in 1942. When the rain came in the last week of July, it ran down the new lines exactly the way Wendell had calculated it would, filling the lower zones without pooling, reaching the upper trees without starving the middle ones. And Wendell stood at the top of the property with his hands in his pockets and watched the water move. And he did not say a word, and nobody was there to watch him not say it. Let me tell you about the first winter. In October and November of 1989, Wendell began work on the trees themselves. He did not start on all 64 of them. He started on 14. The 14 he chose were the trees along the upper fence line, where the drainage was best and where the soil had degraded the least, and where he believed he had the strongest chance of proving to himself first and to the land second that what he intended to do was possible. He spent the last week of October just studying those 14 trees. He traced the lines of healthy wood down each trunk with the blade of a small knife, peeling back the outermost layer of bark in a thumbnail-sized window and looking for the faint green line of living cambium underneath. On 6 of the trees, the answer was almost nothing. On 8 of them, it was more than he expected. He grafted through the cold mornings of November, working with the grafting knife Clement had given him in 1958, and the whetstone that sat on his workbench, sharpening every blade at 12 degrees on the same stone he had used for 50 years. He cut scion wood from the one surviving Prater Keeper tree on the south slope of the home place, the tree Clement had planted in 1966, with scion wood that Edna Frasier had given him in the fall of 1965. The scion was dormant clean and full of the kind of vigorous two-year growth that a grafter prays for. He wrapped each union in budding rubber and walked away. By the last day of November, he had finished all 14. He covered the remaining 50 trees with 6 inches of hardwood mulch at the base chopped chips he hauled in the Chevy from a sawmill outside Perry. The cover crop died back with the first hard frost and laid down on top of the soil like a thick green blanket, and Wendell walked the property one last time on the 1st of December, 1989, looked at his work, and drove home. The cost tally for year one stood at $47 for cover crop seed, $286 for irrigation parts, $22 for grafting supplies, and nothing for labor because Wendell Prater had never billed himself $1 an hour for his own work in 64 years of life. Total investment, year one, $355. Total income from the orchard, year 10. Notebook entry in Wendell's tight, careful handwriting. 14 grafted soil active in upper rows by late August. Earthworms present in 2 sample spots. Trust the slow. Let me tell you about the second year. In the spring of 1990, Wendell expanded the cover crop rotation. He added hairy vetch in the low sections where nitrogen fixation was needed most urgently, and buckwheat in the middle rows to suppress the thistle that had started moving in from the roadside ditch. He planted comfrey starts along the entire length of the south fence line, 6 plants at $2.50 apiece, because Edna had taught him that comfrey's deep taproots would pull minerals up from 4 feet below the surface and deposit them in the leaves that he could then cut and drop as mulch. Royce Keltner drove past the orchard on a Thursday morning in the middle of June with a fresh John Deere brochure on the seat beside him. He slowed the pickup to a crawl along the gravel shoulder. He saw Wendell on his hands and knees in the middle of the 3rd row, pressing his fingers into the soil, and Royce lowered his passenger side window and leaned over and yelled across. "Wendell," he called out, "how's the kingdom of heaven coming along out here?" Wendell did not stand up. He did not look up. He said without raising his voice, "Slow, Royce. The good ones always are." Royce sat with the window down for another 5 seconds, waiting for something more. Nothing more came. He rolled the window back up, shook his head, and drove on toward town. That was the last time Royce Keltner spoke directly to Wendell Prater for almost 4 years. The notebook entry for August of 1990 read earthworms in the upper section, mid-August, first time. Edna would have smiled. Let me tell you about the 3rd year. In the summer of 1991, the drought came. It was the worst drought in eastern Iowa since 1956. The corn on the home place curled and browned in the rows by the middle of July. The catchment tank on the orchard ran low in August and did not recover. Wendell had to make the choice that every farmer in central Iowa made in some version that summer, which was to decide which piece of land was going to get the water that was left and which was going to have to go thirsty. He watered the corn. The corn was his income. The corn paid the property taxes and kept Ruth's Blue Cross premium current and put diesel in the Minneapolis Moline and kept the Chevy insured. He let the orchard go for 11 days at the end of August. When the rains finally came back in the first week of September, 9 of the 14 grafted trees along the upper fence line had died at the union. The graft wood had dried out above the rootstock, and the thin column of living tissue that connected them had broken, and there was no saving any of it. Wendell stood in the upper row on a gray September morning and counted the 9 dead grafts one by one, and then he walked down to the shed and sat on an overturned bucket for 20 minutes, with his forearms on his knees and his cap in his hands, and he did not say anything, and he did not let himself think anything that he did not want to be thinking. Then he stood up, put his cap back on, drove home, and ate supper with Ruth without mentioning any of it. In October of 1991, he cut new scion wood from the Prater Keeper and re-grafted the 9 lost trees with stronger second-year material. He grafted slower that fall. The notebook entry for that year read "Lost 9 to the drought." Replanted second-year wood. Patience is a discipline It is not a feeling. Let me tell you about the fourth year, because the fourth year was the year the ground began to answer. In the spring of 1992, 8 of the original 14 upper fence trees put out new growth that was visibly, unmistakably different from anything the orchard had produced in 2 decades. The leaves came in wide and dark green, the color of genuine, honest health, carried on new branches that had pushed 6 to 8 inches out from the graft union in the prior season. Wendell stood among those 8 trees on a morning in the last week of April 1992, with the low sun coming across the slope and the new leaves catching it, and he allowed himself one small private nod before he moved on down the row. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply registered the fact of what he was looking at, the way a man registers a fact he has been waiting a long time to see, and then he went back to work. The memory came to him that afternoon in the middle of the 5th row while he was pruning out a dead lateral on a graft that had not yet fully taken. He was 12 years old again, sitting on the top rail of the cattle fence behind the Prater barn in the fall of 1937, and his father was standing beside him with both hands on the rail. Clement was looking out across a pasture that had been overgrazed in 1935 and that had taken 2 full years of rest and rotation to recover, and Clement said without turning his head when land decides to come back, "Wendell, it comes back loud. You won't have to wonder, you'll know." Wendell had not thought about that sentence in 40 years. He thought about it now, standing in the middle of the 5th row of a dying orchard on Highway 17, looking at 8 trees with new growth the color of health. He pruned the lateral clean. He moved on to the next tree. Through the rest of 1992 and into the spring of 1993, Wendell grafted the remaining 50 trees in 3 waves, moving down the slope from the upper fence toward the low corner, using the same technique, the same scion wood, and the same patience he had used on the first 14. The second wave went in with far higher success than the first. He had learned the property by then. He knew which trees along the middle rows had strong cambium still active under the bark, and which trees in the lower section would need their crowns cut back hard before any grafting could take. By the end of the spring 1993 grafting window, he had grafted 52 of the 64 trees on the property. The remaining 12 he had written off. They were too far gone, even for a man who believed what he believed about starved ground and about the patience of old root systems. He replaced those 12 with young rootstock seedlings he had started himself in tin wash tubs behind the shed, grafting the Prater Keeper onto the seedlings in the same motion. Cost tally for year 4, $136 in grafting supplies, seed, and mulch. Income from the orchard, year 40. Cumulative investment through the end of 1992, $648. Cumulative income, 0. Then came year 5. Let me tell you about year 5 because year 5 nearly broke every other part of Wendell Prater's life open. It was the 3rd week of July 1993. The cover crops were thick and high between the rows. The new grafts were in their 2nd growing season. Caleb Rennick, who was still working the night shift at Casey's General Store on the east edge of Ogden for $3.85 an hour, did not yet know that he was going to be part of any of this. Ruth Prater did not yet know that she was not going to be standing up at the end of that week. Wendell drove out to the orchard at 5:40 in the morning on a Tuesday. The sun was already up. The air was already warm. He planned to spend the morning thinning the 3rd row and checking the fall irrigation for a small leak he had noticed the previous afternoon. Ruth was in the kitchen at the home place 13 miles to the east, setting the percolator on the stove for her 2nd cup of coffee of the morning. She was 66 years old. She had never smoked a cigarette in her life. Her blood pressure was textbook, and her cholesterol was within normal range, and she had been walking a mile along the county road every morning for 18 years. The pain started in her left shoulder at 6:15. She set the percolator down. She sat down at the kitchen table. She tried to draw a deep breath and could not. She reached for the telephone on the wall by the refrigerator, and she made it to the receiver, and she dialed the first 3 digits of the rescue squad number before her legs gave out and she slid down the wall to the kitchen floor with the receiver hanging by its cord beside her head. Evelyn Tinsley Hobart's wife was driving up the Prater farm lane at 6:35 with 2 flats of early tomatoes from her garden that she had promised Ruth the week before. She saw Ruth's car in the yard. She saw the screen door standing wide open. She called Ruth's name from the porch and got no answer. She walked into the kitchen. She called the rescue squad from the same phone Ruth had been reaching for, and she sat on the kitchen floor beside Ruth with Ruth's head in her lap until the ambulance came down the lane 13 minutes later. The rescue squad got Ruth to Mary Grilly Medical Center in Ames by 7:20. They ran Wendell down on the radio through the Boone County Sheriff's dispatch, and the deputy reached him in the orchard at 7:35. Wendell drove to Ames in the Chevy at a speed he did not want to remember afterward. Ruth survived the heart attack. The doctors told Wendell on the second day that there was 55% damage to the left ventricle and that Ruth was going to need to stay off her feet for at least 6 months, and that any real physical labor for the rest of her life was out of the question. Wendell sat beside the hospital bed on the 4th evening when Ruth was finally strong enough to talk clearly for more than a few minutes at a time. He said, "I'm selling the orchard. I'll take you to your sister's in Des Moines until you heal, and then we'll live on the home place, and I'll put the corn ground out to custom rent, and we'll be fine." Ruth looked at him for a long moment from the white hospital pillow. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were exactly the eyes he had been looking at for 24 years. "Wendell Prater," she said, "if you sell that orchard because of me, I will divorce you from this hospital bed. Clement's tree is in those grafts. Edna Frasier's patience is in that ground. You finish what you started." Wendell did not answer. He sat with that for a while. Then he said, "I don't know anyone who would work for what I can pay Ruth." Ruth closed her eyes for a moment. She said, "Find someone." Hobart Tinsley mentioned the boy to Wendell at the co-op 3 days later. There was a kid, Hobart said, named of Caleb Rennick, 18 years old, just graduated from Ogden High. His family had lost their farm in 1989 to the Federal Land Bank out of Omaha, and his father had not been the same man since. The boy was working the night shift at Casey's General Store on the east edge of town for $3.85 an hour, and Hobart had heard from the boy's aunt, who came into the co-op on Fridays, that the boy had driven 90 minutes once on a Saturday off just to pick apples at a U-Pick orchard outside of Boone because he liked them that much. Wendell drove the Chevy to Casey's General Store on a Friday evening in the last week of July. He bought a bottle of Coca-Cola from the cooler. He paid at the register. The boy behind the counter was tall and thin with the long, clean hands of a person who had never quite had enough to eat. Wendell looked at him across the counter. "Caleb Rennick," he said. The boy nodded. "My name is Wendell Prater," Wendell said. "I own 4 acres on Highway 17 that most people in this county think is a dead orchard. I need somebody to work it for 30 hours a week at $4.50 an hour starting next Monday. My wife is recovering from a heart attack, and I can't do it alone this season. You interested?" Caleb Rennick looked at him for a very long moment. "Mr. Prater," he said, "I don't know anything about apples." Wendell said, "Good. I don't have to unteach you." He put a $10 bill on the counter for the bottle of Coke, told Caleb to keep the change, told him to be at Highway 17 at 6 the following Monday morning, and walked out of the store. Caleb Rennick showed up on Monday morning in a pair of work boots that were 2 years too small and a flannel shirt that had belonged to his father. Wendell handed him a canvas seed bag and walked him through the first row. By the end of the first week, Caleb knew every tree in the upper section by sight. By the end of August, he could read the leaves on a graft well enough to tell Wendell which trees were going to push new wood that fall and which were going to hold steady. By the time Ruth came home from the hospital in the last week of August, with a home health aide coming 3 times a week and an oxygen tank beside her reading chair, Caleb Rennick was in the orchard from dawn to noon, 6 days a week, and Wendell was paying him out of the corn money from the home place, and nobody in Boone County yet understood what was happening on Highway 17. Cost tally for year 50 in new equipment, $5,400 in wages to Caleb over the balance of the year, and a medical ledger Wendell did not look at directly for 8 months. Income from the orchard year 50. He wrote in the notebook that October 1 boy, one widow's legacy, one more season. Ruth will outlast them. So will the ground. Let me tell you about year 6 because year 6 was the year the orchard paid Wendell back what he had paid for it. In the fall of 1994, the 10 oldest grafted trees along the upper fence line produced their first real crop, 40 to 50 pounds per tree. 620 pounds of Prater Keeper apples, clean-skinned, dense-fleshed, firm, and sized beautifully. Wendell and Caleb picked that crop together over 11 days in early October. Caleb learned to grade on the flatbed of the Chevy, sorting the fruit into 3 tiers: premium for the farmer's market, second for the co-op, and third for cider. Wendell sold the premium tier at the Ogden Farmers Market on 3 consecutive Saturdays in the middle of October. 53 cents a pound, sold out before 11 o'clock every Saturday. People who had laughed in May of 1989 stood at his table in October of 1994 and bought apples from him by the half peck and the full peck, and most of them did not recognize the variety, and a few of them asked what it was called, and Wendell told them Prater Keeper and left it at that. At the end of the 3rd Saturday, when the table was empty and Caleb was loading the empty crates into the bed of the Chevy, Wendell drove home with $328 in cash in an envelope on the passenger seat. He walked into the kitchen and set the envelope on the table in front of Ruth. She was sitting in the straight-back chair she had taken to since the heart attack, with a thin wool blanket over her knees. She opened the envelope. She counted the bill slowly. 5 years, she said, for $328. She looked up at Wendell. That's about right. The land just paid you back what you paid for it. Everything else from here on is profit. Wendell sat down across from her. Now everything else is for Caleb, he said. Let me tell you about year 7 because year 7 is the year the second wave of grafts came online and the scoreboard started to shift. In the fall of 1995, the full 52 grafted trees produced a combined harvest of 1,920 pounds. Wendell added a second grocery account with Danielson's IGA on the south side of Perry at 62 cents a pound wholesale. Total cash income from the orchard in 1995, $1,060. Cost tally for year 7, $4,800 in wages, to Caleb $70 in new budding rubber and twine, and nothing else. Net minus $3,810. Wendell wrote in the notebook first year with real fruit. The ground is talking, Caleb is listening. The ledger is still a patient game. Year 8 came in 1996, 3,340 pounds, 2 new grocery accounts in the town of Jefferson, 40 miles west. Income, $3,210. Wendell bought 2 Carniolan honeybee hives from a beekeeper in Cass County and set them at the northeast corner of the property in the first week of May that year. Not because the orchard was short of pollinators, but because he wanted the orchard to be a complete system rather than a set of trees drawing on someone else's bees. The hives cost him $180 and a change. Royce Keltner drove past the orchard one afternoon in the middle of September 1996 and saw Wendell and Caleb pruning together on the middle slope. Wendell was showing Caleb something on a scaffold branch. Both of them looking up at the tree, Caleb's hands held exactly the way Wendell's hands were held. Royce muttered to himself alone in the cab of his truck, "Old man's got an apprentice. World's gone sideways." He drove on to Boone without stopping. By the end of 1996, the cumulative cost tally on the orchard stood at $1,340 in seed pipe grafting supplies, hives, and small tools, plus $23,700 in wages to Caleb Rennick over 4 full seasons. The cumulative income from the orchard stood at $4,598. On paper, Wendell Prater was running a losing operation. On any ledger, Royce Keltner or Dwight Mosher would have recognized the orchard was still a joke. But Wendell was not running the orchard for the ledger. He was running it for the ground. And the ground, by the fall of 1996, was something Wendell could push his fingers into without effort in places that had been dense and pale 7 years earlier. The color had shifted dark. The smell was the faintly sweet smell of active biological life, that Edna Frasier had taught him to recognize in her kitchen in 1962. There were earthworms in every sample spot. The cover crop residue was being worked into the top 4 inches of soil by something other than his hands, and he knew what that something was, and he knew what it meant. In November of 1996, Caleb Rennick's father walked up the gravel shoulder of Highway 17, parked his old pickup 30 feet from the fence, and stood at the fence line with his hands in his pockets. Wendell saw him and walked down from the third row. They did not shake hands through the wire. Caleb's father, whose first name was Ray, and whose last name was Rennick, and whose farm had been lost to the Federal Land Bank of Omaha in the worst month of 1989, said quietly, "Mr. Prater, my boy talks about you like you're his grandfather. I just wanted you to know. Watching you teach him what I couldn't teach him, it is something I don't have the words for." Wendell looked at Ray Rennick for a long moment. "He earns it every day," Wendell said. "That's all any man can do." They shook hands over the fence. Ray Rennick walked back to his pickup and drove away. Wendell stood at the fence for another minute, and the memory came to him whole the way memories sometimes do when the ground has gone quiet enough inside a man to let them come. He was 22 years old again. It was the spring of 1947. Clement Prater was standing on the newly broken third 40 of the Prater farm, the piece he had just bought with his discharge pay, and Clement was saying, almost to himself, "A man who teaches what he knows hasn't ended his work, Wendell. He's doubled it." Wendell had not understood that sentence in 1947. He had not understood it when Clement died in 1978. He understood it standing at a fence on Highway 17 in November of 1996, watching Ray Rennick's taillights disappear down the county road. He walked back up the slope and kept pruning. Let me tell you about the next 90 minutes of this story, because everything before them was preparation and everything after them was harvest. In the spring of 1997, all 64 trees on the original 4 acres were in genuine productive condition. Wendell and Caleb pruned together through February in the cold mornings, working from the upper fence down. Caleb, now 22 years old, and knowing the orchard by sight and by touch better than most men twice his age knew their own backyards. The bees came out strong in April, blooms set heavy through the first 2 weeks of May, and on a warm morning in the middle of that bloom, Wendell stood between the third and fourth rows with one hand on Caleb's shoulder and the other pointing at a single tree on the south side of the middle slope. "That one," Wendell said quietly, "that one's ready for real fruit. First time." Caleb looked at the tree and did not answer. Neither of them needed to. The air between the rows was thick with the sound of 40,000 honeybees moving between blossoms. The scent was the scent of an orchard in its proper condition, which is a scent most men who work the modern commercial system have never actually smelled in their lives. The harvest that fall came to 4,260 pounds. Wendell sold it out completely between the Ogden Farmers Market 2 IGA accounts and a new wholesale buyer in Story County named Tri-State Grocer. Income for year 9, $2,920. Wendell started the second spiral notebook at the end of that season. The first one was full. Let me tell you about year 10. The year was 1998. The month was September. Carl Heffner did not yet know he was driving toward the rest of Wendell Prater's life when he eased his refrigerated truck off of Highway 17 onto the gravel apron at the edge of the Ogden Farmers Market at 9:15 on a Saturday morning. The sound came first, a diesel engine downshifting twice as the truck slowed, then the long, low hiss of the air brakes, which drew the attention of half the market. Then the man himself, 56 years old, gray suit, open collar, the leather shoes of a man who worked in offices and the wrists of a man who had come up through loading docks. Carl Heffner produced buyer for Midwest Grocer Cooperative, which operated 18 stores across Boone, Story, and Greene counties. He stepped down from the cab. He walked the aisles of the farmers market, slowly sampling 2 different growers, moving on without saying much. He stopped at Wendell Prater's table. He picked up a Prater Keeper apple from the front crate and he bit into it, and he stopped in the middle of the bite. Wendell watched him from the other side of the table. Carl Heffner chewed slowly. He swallowed. He looked at the apple in his hand. Then he looked at Wendell. "Mr. Prater," Carl Heffner said, "how much of this can you supply?" Wendell said, "Define supply." Carl said, 800 pounds a week, September through December. 18 stores. I pay 72 cents a pound wholesale. Wendell did the arithmetic in his head in the 3 seconds of silence that followed. He said 500 pounds a week, starting next Saturday. 10 weeks. Carl Heffner extended his hand across the table. Wendell shook it. That was the moment. Let me tell you about the next 10 weeks because the next 10 weeks are the reason this story is still being told in Boone County, Iowa, a quarter century later. Week 1, Tuesday morning, September 15th, 1998. 500 pounds of Prater Keeper in wooden crates in the bed of the 1969 Chevy strapped down with ratchet straps under a tarp. Wendell drove the 16 miles to the Midwest Grocer Distribution Center in Ames and backed the Chevy up to loading dock number 1 at 7:45. Carl Heffner met him on the concrete. The crates came off. 500 pounds on the scale, cash envelope, $360. Carl shook his hand. "Same time next Tuesday, Mr. Prater." Wendell said, "I'll be here." Week 2, 500 pounds, $360. Week 3, 500 pounds, $360. Week 4, Carl Heffner met Wendell at the dock on the morning of October 6, 1998. And before the tarp came off the bed of the Chevy, Carl said, "Mr. Prater, I need 600, starting next week." Wendell did the math again in his head. He thought about the trees, he thought about Caleb's hours. He thought about the 3 new wholesale accounts he had been planning to take on in the spring. He said 600, starting next week. Week 5, 600 pounds, $432. Week 6, 600 pounds, $432. Week 7, 600 pounds, $432. Week 8, 600 pounds, $432. Week 9, 600 pounds, $432. Week 10, the final delivery, November 17th, 1998, 600 pounds, $432. Carl Heffner shook Wendell's hand on the concrete of dock number 1 for the last time that season. Same contract next fall. "Mr. Prater, we'll want 1,000 a week if you can get there." Wendell said, "I can get there." He climbed into the Chevy and drove back to Ogden. 10 weeks total, 5,500 pounds of Prater Keeper apples delivered from a dead orchard to 18 grocery stores across 3 counties of central Iowa. $3,960 in cash. Not a single dollar of it borrowed. Not a single dollar of it owed. Let me tell you about week 6 because week 6 is the week that broke Dwight Mosher's 30 years of certainty in half. It was Tuesday, October 13th, 1998. Dwight Mosher was driving back from the Midwest Grocer Distribution Center in Ames after delivering his own regular load, 18 bins of standard Macintosh off the controlled atmosphere storage system he had financed for $385,000 in 1988. His trucks went to loading dock number 3, the big commercial dock. The dock where the trucks that did 40,000 pounds a week unloaded their pallets. Dwight took the side road out of the yard that ran behind dock number 1 because it was the shortest route back to the highway. He was not thinking about anything in particular. He was tired. His accountant had called him the previous afternoon with numbers he did not want to think about yet. He rounded the corner behind dock 1 at 7:55 in the morning. He saw the 1969 Chevy C10 backed up to the dock. He saw the tarp off the bed. He saw 600 pounds of apples in wooden crates being unloaded onto a pallet by a young man he did not recognize working alongside a tall, gray-haired older man in a canvas coat he would have recognized anywhere in Iowa. He saw Carl Heffner standing on the concrete with a cash envelope in his hand. Dwight stopped his truck in the service lane. He did not pull over. He did not shut off the engine. He sat behind the wheel with his hands at 10 and 2, and he watched. Wendell Prater did not see him. Wendell took the envelope from Carl, shook Carl's hand, climbed into the Chevy, put the truck in gear, and drove out the far side of the distribution yard toward Highway 30 and home. The Chevy passed within 8 feet of Dwight Mosher's front bumper on the way out. Wendell did not glance over. He was thinking about the fuel gauge. He was thinking about whether to stop in Jefferson for coffee. He was not thinking about Dwight Mosher at all. Dwight Mosher sat in the service lane of the Midwest Grocer Distribution Center with his engine running and his hands at 10 and 2 for 3 full minutes, while the Chevy crossed the lot and disappeared onto the county road. Then Caleb Rennick finished breaking down the empty pallet and walked back through the service door into the warehouse, and Carl Heffner walked back through the same door, and the dock was empty, and Dwight Mosher sat in the service lane for 7 more minutes after that. He did not say a word. He did not turn on the radio. He did not move his hands from the wheel. A forklift operator tapped on his window at the 11-minute mark and asked him if he needed anything. Dwight shook his head one time without turning. The forklift operator moved on. At 14 minutes past 8 in the morning, Dwight Mosher put the truck into gear, drove out of the distribution yard, and took the long way home along the county roads instead of the highway. And he did not tell his wife or his foreman or the bank what he had seen that morning. When he got back to his own operation, and he did not tell them that night, and he did not tell them for the entire balance of the week. Let me tell you what Dwight Mosher did in his kitchen at 3 o'clock on Wednesday morning, the 14th of October, 1998, after lying awake in the dark for 4.5 hours. He got out of bed. He did not wake his wife. He walked down the hall in his socks to the kitchen, and he turned on the small light over the stove, and he sat down at the kitchen table with the legal pad and a ballpoint pen and a banker's box of his operating records from 1988 through 1998. He opened the loan paperwork for the Controlled Atmosphere Storage Facility. Remaining principal as of the close of the third quarter, 1998, $301,000. Monthly debt service, $3,400. Projected Apple revenue for 1998, $198,000 gross. Net after cost of goods, labor, fuel storage, operating expense, chemical program, property tax, and the debt service itself, $16,400. He set the page down. He picked up the legal pad. He began doing the arithmetic in the other direction. 4 acres, 500 pounds a week at week 1, scaling to 600 pounds a week by week 5 and holding there. 5,500 pounds total across 10 weeks, 72 cents a pound wholesale, plus a farmer's market run on Saturdays at an estimated $200 per, plus 2 or 3 small wholesale accounts he could not see from the distribution dock, but which he knew from Hobart Tinsley's casual conversation at the co-op over the past 3 seasons had to exist. He estimated Wendell Prater's gross revenue from the orchard on Highway 17 for 1998 at approximately $5,500. He estimated Wendell's direct costs for the season wages to Caleb Rennick at roughly $7,200, grafting supplies, mulch bee maintenance fuel, and small tools at under $8,000. He estimated Wendell's cumulative lifetime investment in the 4-acre orchard from the $300 purchase in April of 1989 through the close of the 1998 season at under $1,400 in materials, plus approximately $28,000 in wages to one single employee over 5 seasons. He set the legal pad down and he looked at the numbers on his own page. $301,000 of remaining debt, $16,400 of projected net profit for the year. Then he looked at what he had calculated for Wendell Prater. Approximately $1,400 in lifetime material investment against a season that was going to gross nearly $5,500 in cash free and clear on 4 acres of ground that every man at the co-op counter had laughed at in May of 1989. Dwight Mosher sat at his kitchen table until the first light came up in the east window at 6:47. He did not go back to bed. He did not eat breakfast. He got in his truck at 7:15 and drove out to his own orchard and walked his own rows, 80 acres of dwarf rootstock on semi-dwarf interstems, drip line at every tree, nitrate and copper and boron and foliar sprays on a 4-week calendar. And he looked at his own trees the way he had never looked at them before. He thought about what Wendell Prater's soil smelled like. He thought about Edna Frasier's name, which he had heard Ruth Prater say once at the co-op in the spring of 1990 and had not thought about since. He thought about the $385,000 he had signed his name to in 1988 at 8.75% interest over 15 years. He thought about the word growth. He thought about the word ownership. He thought about the difference between those two words for the first time in his life. And 18 months later, on a January morning in the year 2000 with snow on the ground, and the bank foreclosure notices already filed in the Boone County courthouse, Dwight Mosher would drive his truck up the Prater farm lane, alone without any convoy, without any pride, and he would knock on the front door of a house he had laughed at, the owner of 11 years earlier, and Ruth Prater would open the door, and he would take off his hat, and he would ask to speak to Wendell. Let me tell you about the spring of 1999, because the spring of 1999 was the season the ledger on Highway 17 finally turned in a direction nobody in Boone County could argue with anymore. The orchard had come into full productive maturity across all 4 acres. The grafts were in their 10th season. The soil that had been pale and dense in Wendell Prater's mason jar in April of 1989 was now dark and friable and full of the faintly sweet smell of active biological life, and a man could push his hand into the ground anywhere in the orchard without effort, clear up to the wrist, and come up with a palm full of worm casts and broken down cover crop residue that would have looked to Edna Frasier in her barnyard in 1962 like exactly the things she had been trying to teach Wendell to build. The bees were in their 4th year at the northeast corner. Caleb Rennick was 24 years old, and he knew the property by sight and by touch in a way that very few men in the state of Iowa knew anything. The projected harvest for the fall of 1999 stood at 11,300 pounds off the original 4 acres. The 2-acre Osterholm parcel leased the previous January at $40 a month was in its 2nd year of cover crop restoration and would not produce for another 3 seasons. Wendell had added 3 new wholesale accounts that spring, a produce buyer in Story County named Paul Mittenhoff, an IGA chain with 4 stores in Greene County, a regional cooperative distributor who had tasted a Prater Keeper at Tri-State Grocer in Ames the previous October and had driven 70 miles to find out where the fruit was coming from. Wendell was handling all of it out of the same spiral notebook system he had started 10 years earlier. The 2nd notebook was full by the middle of April. He began the 3rd one at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening with Ruth sitting in her straight-back chair across from him, and she asked him quietly without looking up from her needlework if he was proud. Wendell thought about the question for a long moment. Then he said, "No, I am not proud. I am glad the ground came back." "That's a different thing." Ruth said Edna would say there's no difference. Wendell said Edna would be right. He wrote the first line in the new notebook. Year 11, ground talking, Caleb listening, proceeding. On a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of May, 1999, Wendell drove the 1969 Chevrolet 10 into the town of Ogden without telling Ruth or Caleb where he was going. He parked at the south end of Main Street. He reached across to the passenger seat and picked up 2 clean quart mason jars that he had wrapped that morning in a folded flannel shirt to keep them from clinking together on the drive-in. He carried them across the street. He walked past the whitewashed front of the Boone County Courthouse Annex. He stopped at the squat red brick building next door that housed the extension office. He had never once set foot inside the building in 28 years of farming in the county. He walked through the glass front door and past the reception desk without stopping. The secretary, a woman named Linda, who had worked there since 1981, looked up from her typewriter and said, "Sir, excuse me, can I help you?" And Wendell Prater walked down the linoleum hallway without answering her, as if he had walked that hallway 1,000 times in his life. He stopped at the open door of the office at the end of the hall. He stepped inside. He set the 2 jars carefully on the far corner of Lowell Beecham's desk in front of a glass paperweight that held a pressed 4-leaf clover. Lowell Beecham looked up from a soil analysis report he had been annotating with a red ballpoint pen. He was 68 years old that May. His hair had gone completely white in the decade since 1989. He wore the same kind of wire-rimmed glasses he had worn on the April afternoon in 1989 when he had walked the Doss property and written the word non-viable across the top of a single sheet of county letterhead. He looked at Wendell. He looked at the 2 jars. He did not speak. Wendell did not sit down. The first jar held pale, dense soil the color of cold fireplace ash. The second jar held soil that was dark and loose and alive, threaded through with tiny white root hairs, still breaking down from a cover crop. The frost had laid flat the previous November. Both samples had been taken from the same single spot on the property. 3rd row middle position. The first jar had been filled by Wendell on the morning of April 15, 1989, the day he had bought the orchard for $300 in cash. The second jar had been filled by Wendell at 6 o'clock that morning before breakfast with the dew still on the cover crop residue. "Do you remember this one?" Wendell said. He tapped the pale jar once with the knuckle of his right index finger. Lowell Beecham looked at the jar. He said, "Mr. Prater, I don't know what I'm looking at." Wendell said it's soil from the Doss property on Highway 17. "I took it out of the 3rd row middle position on the 15th of April, 1989. The same morning I bought the place from Harlan Doss for $300. The same morning you had told Harlan in his kitchen that the ground was non-viable." Lowell Beecham did not move. His hands, which had been holding the soil analysis report and the red ballpoint pen, slowly set both objects down on the desk and folded themselves together in front of him. Wendell tapped the second jar. "And this one," he said, "is soil from the exact same spot, 3rd row middle position. I took it at 6 o'clock this morning, 10 years and 5 weeks apart. Same 4 acres, same hillside, same ground." Lowell Beecham looked at the 2 jars for a long time. He did not speak. He reached out and picked up the second jar and held it up to the gray light coming through the single window of his office. He turned the jar slowly. He set it back down. He looked at Wendell. "I should have walked the property with you, Mr. Prater," he said quietly. Wendell said, "You should have walked it with Edna Frasier in the spring of 1962. She would have taught you then what I am telling you now." And then he said the sentence he had been carrying with him down a hallway he had never before walked for the better part of 10 years. "Land doesn't die, Lowell. It gets starved. Starved things look exactly the same as dead things if you are only looking at them on the surface. The soil on that hillside was alive the entire time I was working it. It was just waiting for somebody to listen to it instead of measuring it." Lowell Beecham did not answer. He did not offer to shake Wendell's hand. He did not apologize. He did not make excuses. He looked at the 2 jars on the corner of his desk, and then he looked up at Wendell, and there was something in his face that Wendell recognized from the faces of men who have spent the whole of a long career operating inside a framework that has in a single morning come quietly apart in front of them. Wendell picked up the pale jar. He wrapped it back in the flannel shirt. He tucked it under his left arm. "Keep that one," he said, nodding at the living jar on the corner of the desk. "So you remember." He walked out of the office. He walked back down the linoleum hallway. He walked past Linda, the secretary, who this time did not say anything and only watched him go. He walked out through the glass front door across Main Street, climbed into the Chevy, and drove the 12 miles back to Highway 17. He worked the rest of the afternoon pruning water sprouts out of the 2nd row. He did not mention the bar or the drive to town to Ruth. He did not mention it to Caleb. He did not speak of it to anyone for the entire balance of that year. The living jar of Boone County soil sat on the shelf behind Lowell Beecham's desk for the next 4 years, and then it sat on the shelf in his den at home for the next 11, and it was still sitting there on the afternoon of November 17, 2015, when Lowell Beecham died of congestive heart failure at the age of 83. Let me tell you about Royce Keltner in the fall of 1999, because Royce Keltner did not get a drive out to the Prater farm. Royce Keltner got a karma that arrived without any of his neighbors needing to help it along. In the last week of October 1999, John Deere Financial Corporation of Des Moines filed the formal paperwork to close the John Deere dealership on the eastern edge of Boone. The filing cited 24 consecutive months of operating losses and a principal debt obligation of $610,000, which Royce Keltner, at 65 years of age, could no longer service on the business he had run for 23 years. Hobart Tinsley mentioned the closure at the cooperative counter on a Saturday morning in the second week of November 1999 in exactly the same tone in which he had mentioned Wendell Prater's orchard purchase to the same counter in the spring of 1989. Royce is done, Hobart said to a row of men that happened to include Wendell Prater, who was standing at the register paying cash for 3 50-pound bags of dolomitic lime for spring application on the Osterholm parcel. The dealership is shutting down by Christmas. The men at the counter absorbed this news the way men in a small town absorb the news of another neighbor's downfall, with the quiet that means everyone is calculating how much closer the news has come to their own door. Wendell listened. He paid for the lime. He carried the bags in the handcart out to the bed of the Chevy by himself. He did not say a word in Royce Keltner's defense, and he did not say a word against him. He drove the 8 miles back to the home place. At supper that night with Ruth sitting across the table in her straight-backed chair, he said, "Royce is closing." Ruth had been eating slowly. Her appetite had never fully recovered after the heart attack in 1993. She set her fork down. "You ought to send him an apple," she said. Wendell looked at her. "That would be cruel," he said. Ruth said, "No, it would be honest. There is a difference." She picked her fork back up. On the following Monday morning, the 6th of December, 1999, Wendell packed a single Prater Keeper apple into a small brown paper bag, folded the top of the bag once, and handed it to Caleb in the kitchen. He told Caleb to drive the 8 miles into Boone, to walk into Royce Keltner's empty showroom, to set the bag on the reception desk at the front, and to walk out without explaining anything to anyone. Caleb did exactly that at 10:15 on a Monday morning in the first week of December. The showroom was nearly empty. A single secretary at the front desk looked up when Caleb came in. Caleb said, "This is for Mr. Keltner from a friend." He set the bag on the desk and walked back out through the glass front door and drove home. Royce Keltner was sitting alone in his glass-walled back office, signing the last of the liquidation paperwork. He watched the tall young man cross the showroom, set down a small brown bag, and leave. He stood up. He walked across the empty showroom. He picked up the bag. He opened it. One apple, deep red shading into gold along the blossom end. A variety he had never seen in any grocery store in Boone or in Ames or in Des Moines. He carried the apple back to his office. He sat down at his desk. He held the apple in his right hand for a very long moment. Then he bit into it slowly. He chewed. He swallowed. He put the apple down on the desk in front of him. He folded his arms on the blotter. He put his forehead down on his folded arms. He stayed like that alone in the office of the dealership he had built and was now closing for almost 15 minutes, and no one in the building came to check on him, and he did not make a sound. And when he finally sat back up, his eyes were red and his face was wet. He finished the apple down to the core. He dropped the core into the small metal wastebasket beside his desk. He did not tell anyone about the apple. He never did. He closed the dealership 3 weeks later. He moved with his wife Margaret into a small house on the north side of Boone, and he lived for 10 more years in quiet, reduced circumstances, and he died peacefully in his sleep in the fall of 2009 at the age of 75. Wendell Prater and Ruth Prater attended his funeral at the Methodist Church on the north side of town. They sat in the back pew. Ruth held Wendell's hand through the service. Neither of them ever mentioned the apple to anyone, and neither of them ever would. Let me tell you about a Saturday morning in January of the year 2000, because that morning on the back porch of the Prater farmhouse is the morning the whole story finally turned. It was the 22nd of January. Snow had been falling since Thursday evening, and there were 9 inches on the ground by dawn, and the county road had been plowed once on Friday night and not again since. The temperature at dawn was 11 degrees above zero. Wendell was standing at the porch railing at 7:45 in the morning in his heavy canvas coat and insulated coveralls, drinking his second cup of coffee out of the steel thermos Ruth had filled for him before she went back to bed. He was 75 years old. His right knee had been worse all that winter. Caleb was inside the kitchen at the stove, 24 years old, and moving with the unhurried confidence of a young man who knew exactly what he was doing, frying bacon and eggs in a cast-iron skillet, visible to Wendell through the back window in the yellow light of the kitchen. Ruth was in the front room in her reading chair with a blanket over her knees and the Saturday edition of the Des Moines Register folded on her lap. She had been up for an hour. She was not reading the paper. She was watching the snow drift along the far edge of the yard. A blue Ford F-250 pickup came up the Prater farm lane at 7:53, moving slowly through the unplowed snow, the tires cutting two clean tracks up the drive. Wendell watched it come from the porch railing. He did not recognize the truck for the first 10 seconds. Then he did. The truck parked beside the Chevy in the yard. The engine shut off. A man in a dark wool coat climbed out of the driver's side door alone. There was no passenger in the truck. He stood for a long moment in the snow beside the driver door, looking up at the farmhouse, his breath visible in the cold. Then he walked around the front of the truck and up the 3 steps of the front porch. Ruth heard the knock on the front door through the wall of the front room. She set the register aside. She walked to the door in her house slippers. She opened it. The man on the porch had his hat in his hand. He said, "Mrs. Prater." Ruth looked at him for a long moment, and she did not smile, and she did not move aside from the doorway. "Dwight," she said, just his first name. One word. She had not seen Dwight Mosher in person since a chance encounter at the Ogden grocery store in the spring of 1994. She had last heard his name spoken at the cooperative counter in the fall of 1989 in a context she had never permitted herself to forget. "Dwight Mosher," said Mrs. Prater. "I was wondering if Wendell was home." Ruth looked at him on her front porch. Hat in hand, snow on the shoulders of his dark coat. 53 years old and looking 10 years older than that, his face thinner than she remembered, and his eyes not at all the eyes of the man who had held court at Hobart Tinsley's counter in May of 1989. She did not invite him inside. "He's on the back porch," she said finally, "around the side of the house." She closed the door gently. She walked back to her reading chair. She picked up the register. She did not read a single word of it for the next 45 minutes. She watched the snow drift along the far edge of the yard. Dwight Mosher walked around the west side of the farmhouse through unbroken snow that came up to the tops of his boots. He came up the wooden steps of the back porch. His boots made a wet scraping sound on the boards. Wendell was still standing at the railing with his thermos. He did not turn at the sound of Dwight's boots. He was looking east across the snow-covered corn ground toward the pale line of the horizon. The storm door between the back porch and the kitchen was closed. Caleb was on the other side of it at the stove, and the smell of bacon was coming out through the gap along the bottom of the doorframe. "Wendell," Dwight said. Wendell turned then. Slowly. He looked at Dwight Mosher standing in the snow on his back porch for a long, long moment. He did not act surprised. He did not act angry. He did not act anything at all. He said, "Dwight, sit." There were 2 wooden porch rockers along the railing. Dwight sat down in the farther one stiffly as if he had rehearsed the motion several times on the drive over. Wendell sat down in the nearer one. He unscrewed the cap of the thermos. He poured hot coffee into the cap. He poured hot coffee into the ceramic mug Ruth had left on the porch railing beside his chair. He handed the cap to Dwight across the space between them. Dwight took it with both hands. For a long while, the 2 of them sat in silence on the back porch of the Prater farmhouse on the cold, bright morning of the 22nd of January 2000, while the snow lay heavy on the corn ground, and the Chevy sat in the yard with a skin of ice across the hood, and a tall young man stood at the stove inside the kitchen, frying bacon and eggs for a breakfast that no one had yet called him in for. Dwight Mosher looked at the steaming cup in his hands for a long time. Then he looked out over the yard, not at Wendell, and he started to talk. I said things about you at the co-op in May of 1989, he said. You were there in Hobart's store one morning in early June. I do not know whether you heard me that day or not. I said the same things 100 other times in rooms where you were not. I called you a fool. I called that Minneapolis Moline rusted clear into your skull. I told 6 men in 1 week that you were going to end your life wandering a graveyard of apple trees with a canvas seed bag on your shoulder, scattering clover by hand like Moses in the Iowa wilderness. I want you to know that I have been carrying every one of those sentences around with me since October of 1998. I watched you unload apples at loading dock number 1 at the Midwest Grocer Distribution Center in Ames one Tuesday morning in the middle of harvest that October. I sat in my truck for 10 minutes after you drove away, and I realized sitting there something I had not wanted to realize for a very long time. I had underestimated you. I had underestimated the land. I had underestimated every single thing I had spent 30 years believing about how you grow apples on 4 acres of ground in the state of Iowa. I was wrong, every part of it, every sentence. Wendell did not speak. He sipped his coffee. He waited. Dwight said the bank is taking the controlled atmosphere storage operation in April. I have not been able to service the loan since the end of 1998. I have been laying off staff since the previous November. My foreman quit 2 weeks ago. My wife thinks I should move into Des Moines and take a job with her brother-in-law running inside sales at a feed distribution company. I do not want to do that. I am 53 years old, Wendell. I do not know how to start over from the beginning. I do not know what I am doing anymore. He paused. The coffee was shaking slightly in his hand. I came out here this morning. He said to ask you to teach me what you taught Caleb Rennick. I will work for nothing. I will start from the first row, and I will do whatever you tell me to do. I will keep a notebook. I will listen. Wendell looked out at the yard for a long moment. He looked at the snow on the hood of the Chevy. He thought about Edna Frasier standing in the doorway of her barn in April of 1962 with a mason jar in her hand, asking him to close his eyes. He thought about Clement standing on the 3rd 40 in the spring of 1947, saying that a man who teaches what he knows has not ended his work, he has doubled it. He thought about Ruth in the hospital bed at Mary Greeley Medical Center in July of 1993, looking at him out of a face the color of the sheet behind her head, telling him that Clement's tree was in those grafts and Edna Frasier's patience was in that ground, and that he was going to finish what he had started. Then he said the second plain sentence of his life, quietly without looking at Dwight. Dwight Wendell said the problem was never that you grew too fast. The problem was that you trusted a system that told you growth was the same thing as worth. It isn't. Owning what you have built is worth more than building what you cannot own. You spent 30 years listening to bankers and agronomists and chemical salesmen who had never in their lives put a hand into a jar of soil and asked it what it needed. You built the biggest orchard in 3 counties on top of a debt that was never going to be paid back out of the ground. You built it on top of the ground instead of out of the ground. There is a difference. Dwight did not answer. He was looking at the coffee in his hands. Come back in March, Wendell said. After the bank takes the storage, bring boots, bring work gloves, bring a notebook. Caleb will teach you the rows. I will watch. If you stay through 1 full season, we will talk about the rest. Dwight Mosher nodded once. He did not trust himself to speak. He sat on the porch without saying anything else for 20 more minutes. The smell of bacon from the kitchen got stronger. Caleb called through the storm door that breakfast was on the table. Wendell stood up. He took the thermos cap out of Dwight's hand. He screwed it back onto the thermos. Dwight said thank you. His voice was rough. He said it the one time. He stood up. He walked back around the west side of the house through his own boot prints in the snow. He got in the blue Ford F-250. He drove back down the Prater farm lane. Ruth watched the taillights go from the front room window. When Wendell came in through the kitchen door, she was still standing at the window. She said without turning, "Is he coming back?" Wendell said in March. Ruth said good. She went back to her chair and picked up the register, and this time she actually read it. Let me tell you about the year 2000. because the year 2000 was the year the ledger on 11 years of work closed, and the whole of Boone County finally saw what Wendell Prater had built. The final harvest from the original 4 acres came in at 17,400 pounds of Prater Keeper apples. The Osterholm parcel added 1,100 pounds in its first real producing season, 18,500 pounds total, moving through the Ogden Farmers Market on Saturdays, through 8 wholesale grocery accounts spread across Boone Story and Greene counties, and through Midwest Grocer Cooperative's 18-store chain under a new 12-month contract Carl Heffner had brought Wendell in March. Gross revenue from the orchard for $2,029,800. Cumulative income from the orchard from 1994 through 2000, $46,200. Cumulative direct material investment, 1989 through 2000, $2,140 in seed pipe solder grafting supplies, beehives and small tools. Cumulative labor cost $38,400 in wages paid to Caleb Rennick over 7 seasons. Net lifetime profit through the close of $5,660, which does not sound like very much until you remember that Wendell Prater had taken 4 acres of Iowa ground that Lowell Beecham had written off as non-viable in April of 1989, and had by the close of the year 2000 built it into a functioning, integrated orchard ecosystem that would still be producing commercial quantities of apples a quarter century later on the same grafts in the same soil under the same management philosophy without having borrowed a single dollar from any bank in the United States of America. Dwight Mosher reported to the Prater farm at 6 o'clock in the morning on the 4th of March 2000 in a pair of work boots he had not laced up in 15 years and a pair of canvas work gloves he had bought new from the hardware store in Boone the afternoon before. Caleb Rennick was 25 years old that March. He taught Dwight Mosher how to prune a mature Prater Keeper graft for maximum fruit set. He taught him how to read the cover crop by color in the second week of April. He taught him how to sample soil from 4 stations and how to feel for earthworms on a morning in May. Dwight kept a notebook. He wrote in it every evening at the kitchen table of his own home after supper. He did not speak at the cooperative counter for the first 3 months of that spring. The men at Hobart Tinsley's counter, who had laughed along with him in 1989, stopped laughing when they saw him come in with soil under his fingernails and sawdust on the cuffs of his jeans. And they did not ask him where he had been, and Hobart never once mentioned any of it aloud. By the end of the 2001 season, Dwight Mosher had sold off 100 acres of his original 160 to pay down the portion of the storage loan the bank's April 2000 foreclosure had only partially absorbed. He kept 60 acres. He replanted 20 of those acres in the fall of 2001 using the cover crop rotation Wendell and Caleb had taught him, starting from bare ground with the same patience Wendell had shown on Highway 17 in 1989. By 2005, those 20 acres would be producing apples of a quality that rivaled the Prater Keeper, and Dwight Mosher would be at the Prater farm every Saturday morning, and Ruth Prater would joke quietly to Caleb's wife, Hannah, that Dwight was their second son, and the speech pattern that had once made Dwight the loudest voice at the cooperative counter in May of 1989 would never quite come back. And nobody who knew him after 2000 would ever have guessed what he had been like before. Let me tell you about the autumn of 2001 because that was the autumn Marlene Ashburn called. Marlene was the extension agent for Greene County, 52 years old, quiet and direct. The kind of woman who had spent her career trying to do a better job than the previous generation of extension agents whose paperwork she had inherited in 1989. She had heard about Wendell Prater from 2 of her own farmers' men who had bought Prater Keeper apples at the IGA in Jefferson and who had driven out to look at the orchard on Highway 17 during the summer of 2001. She called Wendell at the farmhouse on a Tuesday morning in the first week of September. She asked him if he would consider speaking at the Central Iowa Regional Orchardist Conference in the second week of October. Wendell told her he was not a speaker. Marlene Ashburn said, "Mr. Prater, I more or less expected you to say that." He could hear the small smile in her voice through the telephone. She said, "Would you be willing to walk a group of orchardists through the property instead?" Wendell said that I can do. On a Saturday morning in the second week of October 2001, 47 farmers from Boone Green, Dallas Polk, and Webster counties walked the 4 acres on Highway 17 in 3 groups of 12 and 1 group of 11. Wendell led the first group. Caleb Rennick, now 26 years old and effectively managing the daily operation of the orchard, led the second and third groups. Dwight Mosher, in his second season of learning, walked at Caleb's side and led the fourth group. Wendell brought the first spiral notebook with him, the one he had bought at the Boone Pharmacy for 15 cents in May of 1989. He stood at the upper fence of the property with the notebook open in his hand, and he read selected entries aloud to the men standing in a loose half circle in front of him. The entry for the third week of May, 1989. The entry for the first earthworm count, mid-August, 1990. The entry for the loss of 9 grafted trees in the drought of 1991. The entry for the first 40-pound per tree harvest in October of 1994. He read without drama, without embellishment, the way a man reads the dates off a family Bible. Some of the men took notes. Some of them did not. A few of them stood quietly at the back of the half circle and recalculated for the first time in their working lives what they had believed about the economics of orchard agriculture since they were 20 years old. A young farmer from Dallas County, 28 years old, 3 seasons into his own orchard on a piece of ground his father-in-law had helped him buy, in 1998 drove home that afternoon and pulled his pickup over at the gas station on the north edge of Adel and wrote every sentence he could remember in a spiral notebook he found in the glove box. He wrote for 22 minutes without stopping. He drove the rest of the way home, knowing he had been shown 11 years of proof that the single lesson he most needed to learn had been the one single lesson nobody in his agricultural program at Iowa State University had ever even attempted to teach him. Some land, that lesson said, does not need to be fixed quickly. It needs to be given back what was taken from it slowly in the order it was taken, with the patience to wait for it to tell you it is ready. Let me tell you about it, a gray afternoon in November of 2001, because that afternoon is the reason Wendell Prater could rest. The weather had turned cold the week before. The last apples were off the trees. Wendell drove alone in the Chevy up the rutted track behind the home place, past the old cattle fence that ran along the north line to the small square of ground on the rise above the north cornfield that had been the Prater family cemetery since 1919. He parked the truck on the gravel turnaround. He took a single Prater Keeper apple out of a paper bag on the passenger seat, the finest premium grade, off the last tree they had picked that season. He walked through the low iron gate in his canvas coat. He stopped at the headstone that read Clement Prater, October 9th, 1904, to April 3rd, 1978. Beloved husband and father, a good and faithful servant. He set the apple gently on the top of the headstone, balanced on the weathered limestone. He did not sit down. The wind moved through the dry corn stubble in the field below. A grain truck shifted gears somewhere out on the county road. 12 years, Dad, Wendell said quietly. The ground on Highway 17 came back. Edna was right. You were right. The land was starved the whole time. It was never dead. I was just patient enough to listen. He was quiet for a long moment. I hired the Rennick boy in the summer of 1993 when Ruth was in the hospital, Wendell said. He has learned the rows better than I ever taught them. I think you would have liked him, Dad. He asks the right questions, and he keeps his mouth shut until he understands the answers. You used to say that was how a man ought to farm. He is going to take it on after me. He paused. The wind picked up and then died again. Dwight Mosher came out to the place in March of 2000, Wendell said. I did not think he would come. He came. He has been at the orchard every Saturday for almost 2 full years now. He is not the same man he was in 1989. Something in him cracked open the way you used to say ground cracks open in April if you have fed it right through the winter. I think he is going to be all right. Wendell looked at the apple on the headstone. The blossom end caught a sliver of the low afternoon sun. Your Prater Keeper, Dad, Wendell said. 3 counties eat them now. Your tree, your wood, your patience. He stood for another minute without saying anything. I miss you, he said finally. Mom, too. Ruth is not as strong as she used to be, but she is still the best thing that ever happened in my life. I thought you ought to know. He walked back to the Chevy. He drove home. He did not speak of it to Ruth or to Caleb. He did not write it down in the notebook. Some of the accounting a man does in the course of his life is not meant for any ledger. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the years that followed are the reason Wendell Prater's story is still being told on farm porches all across central Iowa. Ruth Prater died quietly in her sleep on the night of December 18, 2006, at 79 years of age. Her heart, which had carried her for 13 years after the attack of 1993, simply stopped sometime around 3 in the morning. Wendell found her in the first gray light of that Tuesday, lying on her side in the bed they had shared since 1969. With the faint, small smile she had always worn sleeping, the last thing he saw before he turned off his own light most nights of his adult life. He sat on the edge of the mattress and held her hand for 45 minutes before he called anyone. He buried her in the Prater family cemetery beside Clement and beside his mother Ella on a gray afternoon 3 days before Christmas, with Caleb Rennick on his right and Dwight Mosher on his left, holding the ropes of the casket lowering, and 170 people standing in the snow in a half circle around the open grave. Most of them people who had laughed at him once in one way or another in the May of 1989. Pastor Vernon Sills, who had spoken from the pulpit of Ogden Methodist about men whose judgments seemed to be slipping, and who was 84 years old himself by then, read the 23rd Psalm over Ruth's grave with his voice shaking and his hat in his hand. Wendell continued to farm the orchard for 4 more seasons after Ruth's death. He slowed the way men of his kind slow in small increments that only the people closest to them could see. In the spring of 2008, at 83 years old, he formally signed over operational management of the orchard to Caleb Rennick, who was 33 by then, and married to a woman named Hannah Reed from Perry, and the father of a 4-year-old boy named Clement James Rennick, named for a man Caleb had never met, but whose philosophy had at 2 removes raised him. Wendell kept the deed to the 4 acres in his own name. Caleb ran the operation. Wendell walked the rows in the mornings with his hands in the pockets of the same canvas coat he had worn to the fence line on the 15th of April, 1989. And he watched Caleb work, and he did not often say anything. He died in his sleep on the back porch of the farmhouse on a Friday morning in the second week of October 2010 at 85 years of age on the morning after the final harvest of the season. Caleb found him in the rocking chair at the east end of the porch at 7:30 in the morning, still in his canvas coat with notebook number 4 open in his lap and his pen still loosely in his right hand and the last entry already finished. Caleb read the last entry through the mist in his eyes. Prater Keeper, year 21, the entry read in handwriting gone shaky and slow. 19,400 pounds off the original 4 acres. Osterholm parcel 4,100. Soil still active. Land still teaching. Caleb closed the notebook. He sat down on the porch floor beside the rocking chair. He did not cry yet. He put his hand on top of Wendell's still hand. He said thank you quietly one time. Then he went inside the farmhouse and he called the coroner's office in Boone. 340 people came to Wendell Prater's funeral on the 18th of October 2010. Some came from as far away as Nebraska and South Dakota and Missouri. Carl Heffner, now 68 years old and retired from Midwest Grocer Cooperative, drove up from a small town outside Kansas City, Missouri, where he had moved to be near his grandchildren. He sat in the 3rd pew on the left. Lowell Beecham, 79 years old and walking with a cane, sat 3 rows behind him. Dwight Mosher, 63 years old, and weathered in a way he had never been weathered in his previous life, sat in the 2nd pew beside Caleb's mother. Marlene Ashburn drove in from Greene County with 4 of the farmers who had walked the orchard in October of 2001. Caleb Rennick, 35 years old, gave the eulogy at the Ogden Methodist Church, the same church Pastor Vernon Sills had spoken from in May of 1989 about men whose judgment seemed to be slipping in their later years. Caleb stood at the pulpit and he did not read from notes. In his right hand, he held a quart mason jar of dark, friable, living Iowa soil from the third row middle position of the 4-acre orchard on Highway 17. He held the jar up so that the congregation could see it from the back pew. Wendell Prater taught me Caleb said that the difference between a man who dies rich and a man who dies whole is whether he listened to the land or talked over it. Wendell listened. That is all. That is everything. He walked down from the pulpit. He set the mason jar on the corner of the closed casket beside the single white rose Ruth's sister had laid there an hour before. He walked back to his seat in the front pew. The congregation was quiet for a very long time. Nobody applauded. Nobody would have thought to. Let me tell you about what came next, because Wendell Prater's story did not end at the grave. It did not even really end at the generational echo, though. The generational echo is the part of the story that tells you the lesson was never about one man and never really about one orchard. In the first week of October 2005, when Wendell was 80 years old and still walking the rows at Highway 17 6 mornings a week, Caleb Rennick came home one afternoon from Story County and told him he had found a piece of ground. 6 acres, an old apple orchard south of the town of Slater. The widow who owned it was selling it cheap because her husband had farmed it for 30 years before he died, and nobody else in the family wanted it, and the property tax was breaking her. $500 for the land, the 64 remaining trees, and 2 hand tools in the shed. Wendell listened to the whole story from his reading chair in the front room. Then he said one thing. "Bring me a jar of soil from it," he said. 2 days later, Caleb set a quart mason jar on Wendell's kitchen table. Wendell picked it up. He closed his eyes. He held the jar for a full minute. Then he opened his eyes. "Starved," he said. "Not dead. Cover crops first year. Vetch and rye in the low sections. Buckwheat across the middle. Graft the strongest trees in year 3. You know the rest." Caleb said, "I know." Wendell looked at him for a long moment. "Then you don't need me," Wendell said. Caleb said, "I'll always need you." Wendell did not answer. He handed the jar back. Caleb Rennick bought those 6 acres in Story County in the middle of October 2005 for $500 paid in cash, and Hannah Rennick drove the check to the widow's house in Slater on a Thursday afternoon, and by April of 2006, Caleb had crimson clover and winter rye scattered by hand across the rows of a dying Story County orchard, using the same rhythm his own father had never quite been able to teach him. And the cycle that had started in Edna Frasier's barnyard in April of 1962 and had passed into the soil of Highway 17 in April of 1989, continued into the soil of Story County in April of 2006, because the lesson Edna Frasier had tried to pass to one young farmer in 1962 was never about one orchard or one widow or one man. The lesson was eternal. The lesson was that the land would teach anyone who was patient enough to be taught. Today in Boone County, Iowa, the 4-acre orchard on Highway 17 still stands. Caleb Rennick runs it at 51 years old alongside his sons Clement, James Rennick, and Wendell Thomas Rennick. Both of them grown now, both of them married, both of them learning the rows from their father, the way their father learned them from an old man in a canvas coat. The Prater Keeper apple, the variety Edna Frasier's father had planted in Webster County in 1911, was formally registered by the Iowa Heritage Apple Society in 2018 as a regional variety worth preserving. The apple is now commercially available through 11 grocery chains across 7 counties in 3 states. Farmland in Boone County in the year 2026 averaged $11,200 per acre. And a young farmer trying to enter the orchard business today would face startup costs of between $80,000 and $200,000 per acre, when the full modern package of dwarf rootstock drip irrigation, commercial chemical programs, and controlled atmosphere storage is accounted for. Or, as Wendell Prater would have said quietly on the back porch of the farmhouse if anyone had bothered to ask him, A young farmer could spend $300 on 4 acres of ground that everybody said was dead and could spend 4 years studying the soil instead of fighting it and could prove the same thing Wendell proved, that the land was never dead. It was starved. And starved things come back when you stop trying to fix them and start asking them what they need. Let me tell you what Wendell Prater would have wanted you to carry away from this story because it is not complicated. Patience costs less than payments. Listening pays better than measuring. Knowledge weighs less than debt. An old idea your father taught you is worth more than a new program a salesman quotes you. The men who told Wendell Prater he was a fool in the May of 1989 are mostly gone now. Royce Keltner died in his sleep in 2009 at the age of 75 in a small house on the north edge of Boone with a Prater Keeper apple in a paper bag on the kitchen table that his wife Margaret had put there that morning without explaining why. Lowell Beecham died of congestive heart failure in 2015 at the age of 83, having kept the living jar of Highway 17 soil on a shelf behind his office desk for 4 years, and then on a shelf in his den for the following 12. Dwight Mosher is 79 years old this year. He still farms the 60 acres he kept after the bank took the storage operation in April of 2000. He still drives to the Prater farm every Saturday morning to have coffee with Caleb Rennick, who does not call him anything but Mr. Mosher. Even now, out of a respect that Dwight did not earn until he was 54 years old and had cost himself 100 acres in a $385,000 loan to learn how to earn it. Dwight keeps a quart mason jar of dark Iowa soil on the kitchen counter of his house. So does Caleb. So does Hannah. So do 52 other orchardists across 3 counties of central Iowa who walk the rows on Highway 17 between October of 2001 and the spring of 2010, and who listened to an old man read them entries from a spiral notebook he had bought for 15 cents. Land does not die. Soil does not lie. Patience always pays, but it pays in the timeline of trees, not in the timeline of men. Wendell Prater knew that at 64 years old on a cold Saturday morning in April of 1989, when he stood at a fence post on Highway 17 in Boone County, Iowa, with a mason jar in the pocket of his canvas coat and $300 in cash folded into the top flap of a worn leather wallet, and the rest of the world is still slowly learning to catch up. If this story reminded you of a quiet man you once knew, a father, a grandfather, a neighbor, a farmer down the road who outlasted every voice that laughed at him, drop a 1 in the comments and tell me about him. If you are working a piece of ground right now that somebody in a clean pair of boots has already told you is dead, share this story with somebody who needs to hear that starved ground comes back. And if you want more stories about American farmers who chose patience over speed knowledge, over debt, and the soil under their own boots over the advice of men in offices who never once put their hand into a jar of dirt, subscribe and stay with us. The next story is already being written.